Take the plunge and listen to Guernsey Deep Dive. Don't forget to like, share, and follow.
Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine a disease so ancient, so feared, it's basically etched into our oldest stories. I'm talking about leprosy, which, well, today we call it Hansen's disease. Historically, this wasn't just about being sick. It carried this really heavy social stigma, a deep fear going way back, like the biblical Zerath, this idea of divine punishment. It really reshaped how people lived together for centuries. So today, we're doing a deep dive into an island's kind of forgotten past, Guernsey. How did this unique Channel Island deal with a disease that, swept across medieval Europe? It was a massive public health thing back then. It's a real historical puzzle.
It absolutely is. And that's a core challenge with Guernsey, you see. Unlike a lot of mainland Europe, where you find leper hospitals, and they call them Maladrie, sort of medieval sick houses, really well documented, old charters, sometimes you even see ruins, Guernsey's history with leprosy is largely, silent. There aren't any definitive records we can point to, no standing buildings. So our mission here in this deep dive is to try and reconstruct a probable history. We're piecing together clues from some really unexpected places, trying to figure out how an island like this, so distinct, managed such a huge crisis. Okay, so just to set the scene a bit, leprosy probably started in Africa or Asia, and it spread, along trade routes, migrations. It reached Europe way back in classical times, but it really peaked, became this major public health issue between about the 11th and 14th centuries. And the reaction across Europe was actually remarkably similar. Sufferers were segregated, put into these special institutions, leprosaria, leper houses, these Maladrie, as we mentioned, and these places had a dual purpose. They were partly for care, yes, but also, crucially, for isolating people from the quote-unquote clean community.
So you have this pretty standard European response, segregation, specific institutions. But then you look at Guernsey, and that's where things get really interesting, where our puzzle really starts. After 1204, right, when the English crown lost Normandy on the continent, Guernsey and the other islands made this huge decision. They stayed loyal to the English monarch, but, and this is key, he continued to rule them as the Duke of Normandy. This gave the islands this really unique status, constitutionally speaking, and importantly, their own legal system. It wasn't English common law. It was based on Norman customary law, written down in something called the Grand Coutumier. So you can think of it as this distinct, really local legal tradition. It meant Guernsey pretty much ran its own legal affairs, separate from London. So given that independence, how did this small island, with seemingly no trace left behind, handle this massive medieval problem?
And our biggest clue, believe it or not, comes from toponymy. That's the study of place names. Think of it like a linguistic fossil, right? Yeah. A word that survives and tells us something about the past long after the actual thing it described is gone. The most compelling evidence we have for leprosy's history in Guernsey is, kind of surprisingly, a single place name you could still find on the map.
La Maladrie.
Yeah, Maladrie. Linguistically, it's a direct descendant of the old French word maladrere. And that word, as we said, was used all across medieval France and Normandy, specifically for a leper hospital or a lazaretto. The root is malade, just meaning sick, and it often got linked to St. Lazarus, who was, seen as the patron saint of lepers.
Wow. Okay. So this one name is like a little historical signpost pointing at this lost place. But what's really fascinating, the bit that's like an aha moment, is how a modern Guernsey place name guide actually translates Maladrie as burial ground. Now, that sounds like a contradiction, but it's actually a vital clue, isn't it?
Exactly. It's not a contradiction at all. You see, medieval leper hospitals almost always had their own cemeteries right there. Sufferers were often seen as ritually unclean, so they were barred from being buried in the normal parish churchyards. A really potent symbol of their separation in life and death.
Right. So that separation continued even after death.
Precisely. So it makes perfect sense that over hundreds of years, as maybe the timber hospital buildings just decayed and vanished, and the disease itself faded from the island. The most enduring feature in people's memory, that the thing that stuck, was its use as this separate burial place for those who died segregated. The name just kind of evolved locally to reflect what remained,
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. And the location itself, you mentioned the Rue de la Maladrie. Where is that exactly?
It's on the western side of the island. It actually forms a boundary between two parishes, St. Saviour and Castel. And it's distinctly rural, historically quite far from St. Peter Port, which was the main town and harbor.
And does that fit the pattern for where these places were usually built?
Oh, absolutely. It fits perfectly with medieval practice. Leprosaria were almost always set up outside the main towns. This did a few things. It enforced that isolation people wanted to reduce fear of catching it. It gave access to fresh water, which was vital. And it usually meant there was land nearby for farming, to help support the place.
Okay.
And the fact it's on a parish boundary, that's interesting too. It could hint at some kind of joint effort. Maybe St. Saviour and Castell parishes chipped in together to run it. Or it could suggest it was one central place, strategically located to serve the whole rural western side of Guernsey. Maybe hinting at a more organized island-wide approach to public health, even way back then, organized parish by parish.
It's just amazing how much you can potentially tease out from one name and a location. But given there are no records, no ruins, how do you actually start to picture what this place might have looked like? I mean, is it just guesswork?
Well, it's frustrating, definitely, like trying to solve a jigsaw puzzle with half the pieces missing, and your main clue is just a word on an old map. But it's not pure guesswork. We use a method called comparative reconstruction. Since Guernsey had such strong historical and cultural links to both Normandy, its legal root, and England, its political connection, we can look at well-documented leper hospitals in those places like, say, St. Mary Magdalene in Winchester is a good example. We use them as sort of blueprints, analogs, to build a likely picture of Guernsey's Maladrie. So if we imagine the layout, you'd probably have an enclosed area, right? Maybe a wall or a ditch around it, controlling who comes and goes, enforcing that segregation, the buildings inside. Probably pretty simple timber-framed structures, which again helps explain why there's nothing left to see today. Timber just doesn't last like stone.
Right, it rots away.
Exactly. But the one thing that likely was built to last, the spiritual heart of the place, would have been a dedicated chapel. And that probably would have been built from local granite.
Okay, a stone chapel.
Yes. And right next to that chapel, the cemetery, that's absolutely key. Archaeologically, finding these separate burial grounds is standard for leprosaria because of that exclusion from parish churchyards we talked about. If archaeologists were to dig near the Rue de la Maladrie and find a cemetery like that, and specifically find skeletal remains showing those telltale signs of advanced leprosy, what's called facies leprosa, which leaves distinctive damage on the facial bones, the nose area, that would be the smoking gun. Definitive proof, and it ties right back to that local meaning of Maladrie as a burial ground.
Okay, so we're picturing this small enclosed community. What about daily life inside? What was it like for the people living there? And how big are we talking? You said Guernsey's population was small.
Yeah, daily life would likely have been very structured, almost like a monastery in some ways, centered around religious services in that chapel. Getting admitted was probably quite formal. Sometimes people even had to take vows. As for medical care, well, not in our modern sense. It was palliative. Basic things like cleaning wounds, maybe some herbal remedies, ensure people got enough food. The main point was really managed segregation, but framed as an act of Christian charity, providing for those who couldn't be in society.
So care and control, basically.
Pretty much. And given Guernsey's small medieval population, yeah, the Maladrie itself was probably very modest, maybe fewer than a dozen people living there at its busiest time, which again makes it understandable why it hasn't left massive ruins behind.
And how would it have been funded? These people couldn't really work much, presumably.
Likely through charity, what they called aumône donations from the local parishes, maybe individuals. It might also have had a small piece of land attached, an endowment, maybe for growing some food. Any residents who were able-bodied enough might have helped with that.
This brings us to something really critical, I think. What did getting that diagnosis actually mean for a person in medieval Guernsey? We tend to imagine the absolute worst, right? In England, for instance, under laws like the Serum use, it was incredibly harsh. Lepers were effectively declared civilly dead. They lost their legal rights, their property basically became invisible in the eyes of the law. Imagine that. But Guernsey, as you said, had its own law, that Norman customary law, the Grand Coutumier. How might that have made things different?
That's a really crucial point. Because justice was administered locally in Guernsey, the whole process of diagnosis and segregation would have been handled right there at the parish level. It would probably involve the parish priest, who'd maybe identify the signs, and then the parish constables, the local officials, who would enforce the move to the Maladrie, not some distant royal court.
So much more local control.
Exactly. And this suggests that maybe the actual experience could have varied quite a bit. It might depend on your family's status, which parish you were from, maybe even how the local seigneur, the feudal lord, felt about it. It wasn't necessarily one size fits all like the English laws might imply. And it's also really important we challenge that simple image of these places as just grim prisons. Modern historians, people like Françoise Berriac who've studied this deeply, describe them more as complex communities. Yes, they offered refuge, shelter, food, spiritual comfort, but also the companionship of others going through the same thing. Inmates formed a kind of society of the recluse. They were removed from the main world, sure, but they lived within their own recognized separate community, with its own life and structure. That's a really different way of looking at it.
It really is. It counters that image of just total isolation and despair, a society of the recluse that suggests some level of community, maybe even a bit of agency. But it does raise another big question, especially for medieval life. Property. Inheritance. If you were declared a leper in many parts of Europe, you forfeited your land, your possessions. Did that happen in Guernsey? Did a Guernsey man diagnosed with leprosy lose his rights to the family land? Land ownership was everything back then, tied up in the feudal system, the fiefs, the rules of inheritance like partage. Do we know?
That's one of the big unknowns, honestly. It's a fascinating area for more research. You'd need to dive deep into Guernsey's specific land records, these things called livres de cage. They meticulously record land ownership and transfers. Maybe buried in those records are clues, perhaps sudden transfers of land, or maybe even little notes saying an owner was malade, sick. It's possible. So from the 14th century or so, leprosy starts this slow, steady decline across Europe. Why? Well, the reasons are still debated. The Black Death might be part of it. It killed so many people. Maybe it broke the chains of transmission for leprosy too, or perhaps changed the human gene pool somehow.
Interesting theory.
There's also a theory about cross-immunity with tuberculosis, which was becoming more common, and just general gradual improvements in living standards might have made people more resilient. It's pretty reasonable to think that these same factors were probably at play in Guernsey too. Fewer cases over time meant the Maladrie became less and less necessary.
And what typically happened to these places when the disease faded?
Across Europe, many were repurposed. They often became almshouses for the general poor, or sometimes evolved into early forms of hospitals for other conditions.
Right.
The Guernsey Maladrie likely just faded away similarly. Maybe its small endowment or any remaining buildings got rolled into the general parish poor relief system.
So it sort of paved the way for later institutions.
Exactly. It foreshadowed places like the town hospital set up in St. Peter Port in 1742 and the country hospital out in Castell in 1751. Those marked a new era in Guernsey's public health. By that time, the original purpose of the old Maladrie was probably long forgotten in an institutional sense.
But there's a modern resonance here too, isn't there? Something that connects back.
Yes, absolutely. And it brings the story right up to date in a powerful way. Guernsey today has this really strong, ongoing philanthropic connection with the leprosy mission. Island residents actively support facilities like the Anandaban Hospital in Nepal. And when you put that modern action alongside the medieval history, you see this incredible transformation. The medieval response to Maladrie was local, it was insular, based on theology, and driven by segregation, isolating the afflicted to protect the local community. The modern response, it's global, it's scientific, it's humanitarian, it focuses on treatment, rehabilitation, and really importantly, fighting the very stigma that the medieval world helped create.
Wow.
It's almost like a form of historical reconciliation, isn't it? Moving from isolating their own people in fear to actively participating in a global effort of care and removing that stigma. That's the real journey here.
So we've really covered some ground in this deep dive, starting with just a single name on a map, this linguistic fossil, as you called it. We've managed to piece together the likely story of this hidden institution, giving a voice maybe to a community that's been silent for centuries. That Rue de la Maladrie, it's way more than just a street name. It feels like a monument in language to people who lived and died apart. A really poignant reminder of this lost bit of Guernsey's history.
And the exciting thing is, the story might not be over. There's real potential for future discoveries. Practically speaking, archival research is getting easier, especially with digitized records on platforms like Find My Past. You could systematically search parish registers, those land record, livre de parachage, maybe even old wills, looking for those indirect clues.
And archaeology.
Definitely. Non-invasive stuff first, like geophysical surveys in the fields near the road. They can sometimes detect buried walls, like chapel foundations, or the outline of that crucial cemetery without digging. And then, of course, targeted excavation. Finding those skeletal remains with the clear signs of leprosy, the facies leprosa, that would be the ultimate confirmation.
It's just incredible to think how much history can be hidden right under our feet or tucked away in a place name we walk past every day. Makes you wonder, doesn't it? What other hidden histories are out there waiting in old documents or familiar landscapes? What really stands out to you listening to this about this amazing story of, well, resilience and change over centuries?
Thanks for listening to Guernsey Deep Dive. Don't forget to follow for the latest updates. Any questions or queries, email guernseydeepdive@gmail.com.